Cool. Should be live. Okay. Should be live. Okay. Good evening, and we are live. Let's wait a few seconds. Buonasera. We'll wait a few minutes. I'm Luca Cottini. And okay, thank you for coming. I'm Luca Cottini. I'm a associate professor of Italian studies at Villanova University and host and creator of Italian Innovators, a YouTube platform featuring interviews, profiles, and lessons on Italian innovation in design, music, technology, and fashion. Welcome to this presentation tonight entitled Italy's Commercial Penetration in the United States, from Emigration to the Economic Boom. This presentation is being sponsored by the Consul General of Italy in Philadelphia and is part of the Italian Design Day that is being celebrated throughout the world. In this presentation, I really would like to show how Italians moved from being kind of associated to immigration, to war, to the dictatorship, to becoming the ones that everybody wanted to imitate. So in the 1960, after being elected president, JFK organized the first gala at the White House. And it's really not by chance that the first of the guests who was invited was Italian. It was Gianni Agnelli. So today we'll talk about influence. So how influence really precedes a commercial strategy, and how influence creates a presence, a long-term presence that becomes a sustainable business. So we'll talk about these years after the war as the origin of the sustainable and successful presence of Italian industry in the United States today. So I want to start with an order of events. We'll have at the beginning some initial remarks from the Consul General of Italy, Cristiana Mele. Then I'll give a presentation about like 30 minutes, and then we'll have time to have some question, which you can write down in the chat. It is really my honor to welcome Consul Cristiana Mele and thank her for this beautiful opportunity to share my ideas and my research with all of you. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Professor Cottini, and welcome everybody to this celebration of Italian Design Day. I'm really grateful to Dr. Cottini for this presentation, because we are exploring the very origin of how Italian design permeated the experience of living like an Italian, of Italian living in the US. And I think it's important to stress the shift of this imagination of Italy. As our Minister of Foreign Affairs said in kicking the this year's celebration of Italian Design Day, we have so many important things to share. This year's theme is the urban regeneration, the reuse and recycling of materials. And this is our also message for our candidacy to host the Universal Exposition on 2030, because we are living in a world that needs more than ever sustainability. But how this can be done through design? And I think this is an open question, but at the same time, we want to see what really has made Italians the masters of design. And when we understand what we can bring to the word design, then it will be useful to find new viable solution for the world we live in, and the circular economy, the sustainable technology, putting together what is a vision that architects, designers, innovators can share together. So we're looking forward to hearing from you, Luca, if you can highlight how we became at the center of international design and what we can bring more, and what is the future of urban design and this industrial design in the coming years for a better future. With this, I leave the floor to you, and I'm listening like everybody else here to your amazing stories. Thank you.
And thank you for being here. Thank you for your kind words and the invitation and the sponsorship of this event. Now, reconstructing the story of Italy's industrial penetration in the US in the years after World War II is not an easy undertaking. And in the face of such a varied, complex, and often sporadic universe of commercial and cultural relationships, my contribution is necessarily linked more to a story of events and personalities in which constellations of meaning and relationships are concentrated rather than to a systematic survey of the market statistics, distribution channels, and trading volumes. Having said that, in order not to appear without data, I want to start by showing you two graphics that highlight first the incredible economic growth that the post-war laboratory was able to launch in the long run. Here are the last 3 decades. And second, the contemporary impact of the Italian industry in the United States, which, contrary to what we might think, has the mechanical and the pharmaceutical sectors as its primary export. Even if it is not in the first place, the food sector remains fundamental, and Italy remains the first US exporter of wine, cheese, oil, and pasta. Now, to go back to the post-war years, my task today is to give order to an irregular web of economic relations, and at the same time to reconstruct what Italians call un immaginario, an imagination, that is a word of meaning associated with Italian products. As for the asystematic growth of the first Italian industrialization between the 19th and 20th centuries, which I reconstruct in my book, The Art of Objects, also the Italian penetration in America after World War II is not an elaborate program, apart from the case of Olivetti, which we will see, but rather a cloud of trigger events capable of generating trends, momentum, cultural magnetisms, or what today we will call influence or influences. Now, the historic channel of Italy's commercial penetration in the United States is certainly the Great Emigration. After the first initial period at the end of the 19th century, in which the Italian state tolerated emigration as a temporary remedy to the agricultural crisis, starting from the beginning of the 20th century with the law of 1901, which established the General Commissariat of Emigration and established migratory flows, Italy began to consider migrants more and more as economic ambassadors of the country, and the Italian communities abroad, small markets. And even after the colonial failure of Adwa in 1896, as potential colonies. Fascism diverted migratory traffic to the colonies of Africa, but nonetheless continued to emphasize the role of Italians abroad as embedded promoters of the national industry. Now, these brief considerations illustrate our reference context. So after the Second World War, Italian industry then had an internal market of departure, mainly destined for the Italian-American community, an export market that a company like De Cecco had exploited since the Chicago Exposition in 1893. But to reach the wider American public, Italy had to build a new appeal, glamour, or fascination that could dismantle its previous associations with poverty, crime, and the fascist dictatorship. My reflection, therefore, has to do with the creative laboratory of the post-war years as, one, the period of Italian penetration beyond the Italian community in the United States, and two, as the period of slow incubation of a new Italian influence, giving the country a new industrial authority, aesthetic novelty, and commercial legitimacy. Now, what was the Italian imagination in America in the late 1940s? If we were to reconstruct the American public's mental associations with Italy, we should start with the icons of the contemporary Italian-American community. So Joe DiMaggio in sports, Frank Sinatra in entertainment after his debut album in 1946. And in the religious sphere, Mother Frances Cabrini was canonized as the first American saint in 1946. Now, among the Italians of Italy, not linked to the Great Emigration or fascism, four towering figures were recognized as admirers models of excellence, leadership, and imitation. So roughly around 1948, we should include Prime Minister Alcide De Gasperi, celebrated on the cover of Time in connection with the American investment in bringing Italy into NATO. Physicist Enrico Fermi, Nobel laureate in 1938, mind of the Manhattan Project and professor at the University of Chicago. Maria Montessori, educator, candidate for the Nobel Prize in 1950 and 1951. And Arturo Toscanini, recognized as really the greatest conductor of our time, of his time. Toscanini was particularly dear to the American public because in 1948, he produced the first telecast in history. That is the first live performance ever broadcast on TV. In 1920, Toscanini was the first to bring the La Scala Orchestra of Milan to the United States for the first recording. And in the 1930s, he was the first to broadcast live on the radio with his NBC Symphony Orchestra. From 1948 until his retirement in 1954, Toscanini would be a recurring presence for the National Broadcasting Company on nascent American television. Just for the record, WWII began programming on January 3rd, 1954. Now, in this studying context, three events of 1948 are, in my opinion, significant momentum shifters, or rather facts capable of changing the tone and creating a positive momentum toward Italy. The first is the visit of the engineer Corradino d'Ascanio to the International Congress of the American Helicopter Society in Philadelphia, where I'm from. D'Ascanio, who had gained international recognition for his 1946 Vespa, was actually the inventor of the helicopter in 1930. His helicopter project was never expanded by fascism, which in the early 1930s was more intent in celebrating the feats of the hierarchy Italo Balbo with his flights from Rome to Rio de Janeiro in 1931 and Chicago in 1933. But on the occasion of the 1948 conference, D'Ascanio was hailed and recognized as the true pioneer of the new technology. Now, the link between Philadelphia and helicopters was and remains very strong, as documented by the founding of the Piasecki factory in 1940, which was then acquired by Boeing, and then by the choice of the city as the production headquarters of Augusta Westland since 1981. Now, Augusta Westland Philadelphia Corporation is now part of Leonardo Finmeccanica and is the leading helicopter manufacturer in the country. Now, the second event of 1948 was the opening of the first Ferragamo store in New York after the Neiman Marcus Prize awarded to it the previous year. Now, Ferragamo was a returning immigrant raised in Naples, transplanted to Boston in 1914, and from there to California, where he made his fortune by producing shoes for the nascent film industry. Back in Italy in 1927, he opened his first shop in Florence, and at the time, he was already an acclaimed name, especially for his famous design of the rainbow shoe sandal in honor of Judy Garland, star of The Wizard of Oz in 1939. Now, in the 1950s, Ferragamo designed the now cult collection of heels for Marilyn Monroe. Now, if you want to draw a line from the archetype to the present here, we can find ideal extension figures of Ferragamo in Milena Canero, costume designer for Hollywood, awarded 4 Oscars, and Cesare Casadei, who's the leader of the most renowned Italian stiletto shoe company. Now, the third event, also in the fashion field, is the first important overseas commission for the sisters Zoe, Giovanna, and Nicole Fontana, owners of a small atelier in Rome since 1943, who were charged of designing the wedding dress of the Mexican actress Linda Christian. The wedding of 1949 with the actor Tyrone Power brought their work to the fore, even before the strong recognition obtained in 1951 at the first fashion show organized in Florence by Giovanni Battista Giorgini. This was the event that launched the Italian fashion project and built the idea of elegant simplicity as the national style. Over the following years, the Fontana sisters will become the most genuine and visible expression of this new glamour in the clothes that they designed for international celebrities such as Liz Taylor, Audrey Hepburn, Anita Ekberg, Grace Kelly, Margaret Truman, daughter of the president, and Jackie Kennedy. Here is her dress for Jackie Kennedy. Now, in parallel to Giorgini's first fashion show in 1951 and the cover dedicated by Newsweek that same year, that the Newsweek dedicated to the genius of the Italian designer Elsa Schiaparelli, another couple of relevant events precede the development of the cinematic narrative of the Italian Dolce Vita, from Roman Holiday by William Wyler to 1954 with Audrey Hepburn and Gregory Peck to Fellini's 1959 masterpiece. So one is a commission, the other is an exhibition. Now, in 1951, a year before meeting Enzo Ferrari, Battista Farina, or rather Pininfarina, designed his first American car, the Nash Haley Gran Turismo, in the wake of his established fame, not only for his refusal to work as chief designer of Henry Ford in the late 1950s, in the late 1920s, but also in light of the subsequent foundation of his company in Turin in 1930. Pininfarina was also recognized in 1949 because it was part of the team that designed the Cisitalia, which is the first car to be part of the permanent collection of MoMA in New York. Now, the 1951 Nash Haley was the first Italian car that really made it into the American market. Now, with regard to the exposition, At the beginning of 1951, the Brooklyn Museum organized the most important exhibit entirely dedicated to the Italian product, entitled Italy at Work, Her Renaissance in Design Today. This exhibition marks the starting point of the Italian incubation period in the United States, which we ideally end with the 1972 exhibition at MoMA, the new domestic landscape. We'll talk about it later. The Brooklyn exhibition was not the first, however. In 1930, the works of Luigi Figini and Gino Pollini, Olivetti's architects in Ivrea, had become part of the international style exhibition set up by MoMA. And MoMA had also set up the 20th century Italian art exhibition in 1949, dedicated to Italian artists not in collusion with fascism. And MoMA will set up an exhibit in 1952 dedicated to Olivetti. But to go back to this exhibit, Italy at Work represents really the moment of greatest impact, both in terms of quantity of objects presented and duration of exposure. A collection of 2,500 contemporary objects collected in the spring of 1950 by Charles Nagel, director of the Brooklyn Museum, in contact with Joe Ponti, father of Italian design, included pieces such as the lambretta, ceramic work, glass, leather, straw, fabrics, toys, furniture, mosaics, tiles, lights, and office machines. Now, after Brooklyn, the exposition was also staged at the Art Institute of Chicago, and until 1953 in Baltimore, San Francisco, Portland, Houston, Minneapolis, St. Louis, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, and Providence. It is in this context that the success of the Italian cinematic imagination matures and evolves. Now, we have already talked about the American discovery of Italy through Audrey Hepburn's amazed eyes in Roman holidays, and the American and not Italian success of the Dolce Vita as an ideal continuation of the season of neorealism and a manifesto of a new Italian glamour. In this context, however, the American awards to Italian cinema became decisive elements to surround the country with an aura of interest and reinforce the sense of its renewal. Now, in addition to the Oscars for Fellini for La Strada in 1955 and Le Notti di Cabiria in 1957, Oscars that would precede the next two for 8.5 and Amarcord in 1975, it is important to remember the Oscars to Anna Magnani for The Rose Tattoo by Tennessee Williams in 1955, which was the first Oscar ever won by an Italian, and to Sofia Loren for Vittorio De Sica's La Ciociara to Women, T61. This is the first Oscar for Best Actor or Actress attributed to a foreign film. In this context, it is also useful to underline the extraordinary international success achieved by the song Nel blu dipinto di blu, interpreted by Domenico Modugno in 1958, and risen to symbol of a new season of Italian glamour. Now, this trail of acknowledgements had the effect of making visible the sensation of an extraordinary industrial reconstruction, which found its most complete expression on the occasion of the 1960 Olympics of Rome, staging the miraculous Italian return just 15 years after the end of the war. With the 1964 Games in New York, in Tokyo, the Rome event symbolically showed America the beneficial effects of military victory in World War II, in parallel with the contemporary development of Hollywood films dedicated to ancient Rome as a metaphor for the new Pax Americana. And you can think here of Ben-Hur, 1959. Now, in the wake of this new imagery of excellence, the automobile and food industry also began to establish themselves on the American market in the 1950s and 1960s. Now, in the automotive field, two personalities are particularly decisive. One is Max Hoffman, and the other is Gianni Agnelli. We mentioned him earlier. Hoffman was the distributor of Volkswagen and BMW in the United States, and starting in the mid-1950s, he also began importing Alfa Romeo, bringing the brand to the American market and requesting in 1961 a dedicated model of the convertible Giulietta Spider. Now, Agnelli was known in America not only for his love affairs with famous actresses, but also for his participation in the Bilderberg Group, which brought together bankers and politicians, including Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller. In the 1950s, Agnelli took over the Ferrari business on the verge of bankruptcy, dividing the management of the races attributed to Enzo Ferrari from production of luxury cars for the market under his control. It was precisely the demand from the American market that first introduced the idea of producing Ferraris for the road. The first model was the Ferrari Dino, which you see, dedicated to Enzo's son, who died at 21 in 1956. Enzo Ferrari had no intention of producing for the public, but it was precisely his need for money to finance the racing business that made him accept the idea of selling cars for the market. Now, the Giulietta Spider and Ferrari Dino were the first two highly successful Italian models in the United States. Now, in parallel with the automotive market, these years also marked the growth of the parts market. In this case, the story of Italian penetration in America is that Rugola, producer of screws and fasteners, which from the 1950s to the present, after the agreement with the state of Michigan to produce all engines in Detroit with Italian screws, is a great example of innovation and entrepreneurship. As for food, and I won't go too much into detail here, the 1950s and 1960s are the period in which part of the American diet began to integrate Italian products, from cured meats to typical recipes, from cheese to pasta. Now, starting from Pietro Barilla's visit to New York in 1952, the pasta market expands. And thanks to the new graphic identity designed by Ernesto Carboni, so the famous logo as a stylized egg with the name Barilla in the yolk and the use of the Barilla blue, the Parma-based company established its leadership on the American market, diversifying its production with breadsticks, sauces, and pizza. Growth will stop abruptly at the end of the 1960s with rampant inflation, and Barilla would be sold to the American W.R. Grace in 1971. It will be reacquired in 1979 thanks to the proceeds from the Italian Mulino Bianco line established in 1975. Now, the confectionery market will also experience great expansion in the 1960s thanks to the success of Nutella, which created a new product category, so spreadable chocolate. It was created in 1964, and it was created already with an international horizon, as confirmed by the fusion of the English nut with the Italian ending ella. Lastly, in the wine category, dominated by the success of Californian Chianti, Italian DOC wine, DOC wine certification of origin wine, will establish itself on the American national market only since the late 1970s, with the certification of controlled origin and production processes, and above all, with the first prize awarded in 1978 by the magazine Decanter to the 1972 Sassicaia, launched on the market by Piero Antinori. This event will launch the glamour of Italian wine and, above all, the glamour of the so-called super Tuscan wines. Now, in this spotty penetration for events or personalities, a separate chapter should be dedicated to Olivetti, the only case where we can speak of a progressive and deliberate expansion strategy. Now, after his visit to the United States in 1926, it is known that Adriano Olivetti reorganized his company, the typewriting business that he inherited from his father, around the principles of scientific management, known as Taylorism. His brother Dino studied at MIT and became president of the Olivetti Corporation of America in 1952. the year in which he opened the Olivetti Research Center in New Canaan in Connecticut and organized an exhibition of Olivetti products at MoMA in New York. The decisive year for Olivetti's growth in the United States, however, was 1954. On the one hand, with regard to the typewriter business, the opening in 1954 of the Olivetti Museum store on Fifth Avenue in New York between 44th and 45th Street consecrated the brand as an icon of style and design, also thanks to the project of the BBPR studio in Milano. BBPR stands for Barbiano di Belgioioso, Peressutti and Rogers. And Olivetti really launched its leadership in the market, a leadership which is confirmed later in 1959 by the acquisition of the competitor Underwood. On the other hand, with regard to the IT development project, 1954 is the year in which Adriano Olivetti, visiting New York, meets the Italian-Chinese engineer Mario Chu, one of the geniuses of the 20th century. He was a professor at Columbia. And Olivetti convinced him to work for his electronic research laboratory in Pisa. Now, thanks to the partnership with the University of Pisa since 1955, and the foundation in 1957 of the General Semiconductors Company, which manufactured new silicon transistors in collaboration with the Californian Fairchild Semiconductors, factory founded the same year that launched Silicon Valley, Mario Chu developed the ELEA 9003 project, designed by Ettore Sozzas and awarded with the Compasso d'Oro. So ELEA 9003 was the first commercial computer in Italy and the first compact central console computer. Now, Olivetti's strategy linked both to expansion into retail with the creation of the first flagship store in America and to research will not lead to the expected takeoff of the company, partly due to Underwood's financial situation, which turned out to be worse than expected, but above all, due to the sudden deaths of Adriano Olivetti in 1960 and Mario Chu in a car accident in 1961. Despite the sale of the computer business to General Electric in 1964, the Olivetti strategy will nevertheless have a profound long-term impact on the Italian and American business culture. In 1965, the company developed the Programma 101, the first portable computer, better known as Perottina, from the name of its designer, Pier Giorgio Perotto. Now, Programma 101 was presented in 1965 in New York and was used by NASA engineers for the Apollo 11 mission in 1969. Also linked to the project were the designer Mario Bellini, whose works are now exhibited at MoMA, and a Federico Fagin, who in 1971 developed the first commercial Intel 4004 microprocessor. While typewriters continued to support the company's budget, Olivetti continued his research project into the 1970s, as evidenced by the 1979 foundation of the Olivetti Advanced Technology Center in Cupertino, California. Cupertino, you heard right. And I invite you to watch the episode of Italian Innovators on YouTube that I dedicated to Camillo and Adriano Olivetti to know more about the connections and the links of the company to Steve Jobs' Apple. Now, at the end of this journey, I would like to dedicate a final reflection on the moments of official legitimation of the Italian appeal between the 1970s and our final deadline, which I traced in 1972 with the exhibition created by Emilio Ambas for the MoMA entitled Italy, the New Novestic Landscape. Now, with regard to the design, the international fame recognized to some Italian designers had extended from Europe to the United States. Now, in the automotive field, the names that have consecrated Made in Italy are those of Pininfarina, Giorgetto Giugiaro, founder of Ital Design in 1968, and Marcello Gallini, who designed the Lamborghini Miura, presented in 1965, the Alfa Romeo Montreal, presented at the Montreal Expo in 1967, or the Lancia Strato Zero concept car, presented in 1970 at the Turin Auto Show. These were pieces that really people talked a lot about in the United States. Now, in the field of architecture and interior design, of course, Gio Ponti's fame paved the way for prestigious commissions, such as the design of the Denver Art Museum, entrusted to him in 1965, and for the recognition of Italy's entire design movement with the MoMA exhibit of 1972. It had been Gio Ponti himself who gave theoretical legitimacy to the Italian design movement, starting from the foundation of the magazine Domus in 1928, and Gio Ponti himself, who founded the Compasso d'Oro Award in 1954. This is the Oscar, the Italian Oscar ceremony of design, and he did it in collaboration with La Rinascente, the department store, as a tool to increase the visibility of Italian products of excellence. Now, the 1972 exhibition in New York ratified this school with the participation of internationally renowned designers such as Ettore Sozzas, Gaia Aulenti, Mario Bellini, Marco Zanuso, Gaetano Pesce, Ugo La Pietra, and the presence of such companies as Cartel, Artemide, or Cassina, which started to create their presence in the United States, starting from this recognition. Now, objects such as Sozza's Valentine typewriter or Castiglione's arc lamp legitimized the idea that Italian design was not just applied art, but rather a new language capable of reading, interpreting, and giving influential form to contemporary reality. Now, in this sense, I would like to conclude with the reference to another contemporary event that similarly consecrated this Italian ability to construct space. It's the publication in 1972 of Italo-Calvino's Invisible Cities, which will become the most influential Italian book in America in the second half of the 20th century, and not just for architecture. It is at this point, at the end of our journey into Italian commercial penetration in the United States, that another project, that of cultural legitimation, begins to take shape with the growth of Italian studies in American universities. It is from the 1970s that the study of the language became an agent of cultural propagation, and that the study of Italian literature, not only classical, became an object of training for young Americans. So the names of Renato Poggioli and Dante della Terza act as the backbones of this cultural project, which would deserve a completely new lecture in se. Now, how is this influence formed? To recapitulate what we said, well, first of all, culture, as we saw, precedes a commercial strategy. Culture creates a soil, an aura, or a narration. So we examined some triggering moments which were able to generate the flair around the product, to change its negative connotations and create new connotations of glamour and appeal. The second consideration is that culture actually assures the long-lasting success of a product. And I would like to add a consideration on culture and sustainability, since the Consul mentioned it earlier, and with regard to the practice and narration of innovation and the creation of this Italian flair. Now, in what we saw, sustainability has to do with limit, which really becomes a resource at an existential level. Think of the story of Ferragamo or the Ferrari Dino, which is born out of a tragic personal story, but also at the level of resources. So from the little ingredients, the little materials that were available after World War II, the ability to invent a future, to create new forms. So in this sense, limit as a resource of creativity. And a good example of a sustainable approach is also, I think, the Mediterranean diet. I talked about it in a post today on LinkedIn. The Mediterranean diet, which included very little protein, was seen by the Italian state in the 19th century as Italy's problem, the reason for Italy's weakness, because it produced shorter and weaker bodies, apparently. And the Mediterranean diet was then reinvented by fascism as a distinguishing element of the Italian character, so presenting Italians as pasta and bread eaters, as opposed to the Northern European diet of meats. Now, the Mediterranean diet was almost eliminated at the time of Italy's industrialization in the 1950s and 60s, when meats had become more readily available. But it was exactly at this time that two American doctors from the Midwest, Ansel and Margaret Keyes, visited Italy, studied the diet of everyday people in southern Italy, and they came up with the idea of the Mediterranean diet as a food regimen that could actually provide eaters with a long life and avoid them diseases coming from overconsumption, so heart attacks or different kinds of cancer. So when Italians became good consumers in terms of calories and variety, their poorer and simpler diet began to be celebrated by American scientists and entered the consciousness of middle-class American consumers. So in this sense, this sustainable approach, which sometimes is born of poverty or little ingredients, is the secret to generating forms that are appealing and new. And with this, I really would like to thank everybody for attending this presentation and leave the floor for any questions, comments you might have. I hope you enjoyed this historical overview of this narration, this storytelling that really created the soil for then a commercial strategy to emerge later in our last few decades, creating the soil for Italy's success. And of course, you can add your questions if you want to ask.
No, Luca, really, Professor Cottini, no, thank you very much, because this was a really extraordinary journey, and the innovation in Italian design and how it shapes our imaginary. And I like that you put together some of my favorite innovator, like Joe Ponti. Joe Ponti was the one who said exactly that, building is the shape of Italian mind, and we are very committed to destiny. And also that it's the future belongs to us, because that's what Mario Chu thought. He thought that only young people can overcome the limits. And this idea of the limit as a resource to creativity is the very sense of the Italian Design Day of today. So thank you very much for putting together all these elements that really make us understand how we can improve our way of living in a beautiful way. Thank you.
Grazie. And if there are no other questions or comments, could you please provide insight on today's Italian influence on the United States? Well, certainly what I did was to trace the genealogy or the origin of an influence that has become recognized. I normally show my students a commercial that is very powerful in explaining this influence, which is the Fiat 500 commercial that was aired a few years ago, where a group of American customers want to purchase a Fiat 500, which was a popular car in the 1950s, which was reconverted in 2007 into a design concept car. And in the commercial, you see the customers that try the car and see that in the back seats, there are like 3 Italians that teach them how to live this car as real Italians. So the car is not just a piece of design or an attractive commercial item, but the car is really surrounded by this Italian flair that makes it attractive and valuable. So it's kind of like an extra element of lifestyle. And so I would use this image to really give you a sense of what this Italian influence is. When an American customer buys an Italian product, the customer wants to buy something that contains this delight, surprising delight, or this surprising extra aesthetic element that makes the product not just a serial item, but something that becomes a unique piece. So thanks again for the question. And thanks for your comments. I'm glad you enjoyed this itinerary journey through the origins of what in the 1950s and 60s was not so visible, and that now is incredibly visible. It becomes so mainstream as to become a commercial, part of a commercial by Fiat that really addresses this influence. There are many more examples, but well, thank you very much for your time, for attending this presentation. And certainly you can find many more stories on Italian innovators who work both in Italy and in the United States in my YouTube channel at Italian Innovators. And you can find daily stories and updates on my LinkedIn profile or on Instagram at Italian Innovators. I want to take this opportunity to thank again the Consul General of Italy for supporting this presentation, and Consul General Cristiana Mele for attending this presentation and offering her remarks. Have a good evening, everybody, and feel free to contact me if you have other questions. Grazie ancora. Arrivederci.